Rain washed the stench of cheap ale and wet horses through the courtyard, but inside the carriage, it smelled like crushed pine needles and murder. Nadine rubbed her frozen fingers together. By the time she realized the velvet seats weren't meant for a merchant's clerk, the doors locked shut. The mud in Oakhaven did not merely stain, it consumed. It sucked at the soles of Nadine's worn leather boots, threatening to pull them from her numb feet with every step. She clutched her satchel to her chest. Inside were ledgers, ink-stained manifests of grain and salt, the sum total of her miserable employment under a merchant who paid her in copper and stale bread. The rain was a relentless, freezing sheet. It dripped from the brim of her wool hood, slipping down her neck, settling like a layer of frost against her spine. She just needed to get to the transport. The carriage heading to the western settlements was supposed to be waiting by the cooper's shop. Through the gray downpour, she saw it. A massive, black-timbered carriage. No crest painted on the doors. No loud, drunken merchants haggling over luggage space. It was just sitting there, horses restless, their breath pluming in thick white clouds. The driver was a mountain of a man wrapped in furs, his face obscured by the weather. Nadine didn't think. Her bones ached with a deep, vibrating cold. Her lungs rattled. If she stood in this storm for another 10 minutes, she would drown in the air. She grabbed the iron handle. It was heavy, slick with rain, but it gave way. She hoisted herself up, hauling her soaking wool skirts over the threshold, and slammed the heavy oak door shut behind her. The silence inside was immediate. The storm vanished, reduced to a muffled drumming against thick, reinforced wood. Nadine exhaled a shuddering breath and leaned her head back against the seat. It was soft, too soft. She opened her eyes, wiping the rainwater from her lashes, and actually looked at her surroundings. Her stomach dropped. The seats were upholstered in deep, heavy velvet. A small brazier, cleverly bolted to the iron-reinforced floor, gave off a low, radiating heat. The air didn't smell of unwashed bodies, damp wool, or cheap tobacco. It smelled of cedar wood, old leather, and something sharper. Something dark and musky that made the hairs on her arms stand up. This was not the merchant's transport. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like a copper coin in her mouth. She scrambled forward, her wet boots slipping on the polished wooden floorboards, reaching for the door handle. The carriage lurched violently. The horses screamed a wild, unnatural sound, and the massive wheels ground against the cobblestones, accelerating at a terrifying speed. Nadine was thrown backward. Her spine hit the velvet cushions hard enough to knock the wind out of her. From the shadows of the opposing bench, a spark flared. Nadine froze. A flint struck steel. The small, erratic flame illuminated the tip of a thin cigar, and then the face of the woman, smoking it. She had high, aristocratic cheekbones, but there was nothing soft about her. Her eyes were pale, the color of winter ice, and they caught the dim light of the brazier with an eerie, reflective glow. Animal eyes. She wore a heavy cloak of dark fur, and her hands, resting casually on her lap, were adorned with heavy silver rings. "I have seen many forms of assassination," the woman said. Her voice was a low, gravelly purr that vibrated in the tight space. "But sending a half-drowned rat to ruin my upholstery is a new one." Nadine's throat closed. She pressed herself into the corner of the carriage. Her mind screamed at her to jump, to throw open the door and roll into the muddy street. But the carriage was moving too fast. The wooden walls rattled. I made a mistake," Nadine choked out. Her voice sounded small, pathetic. She hated it. "I thought this was the transport to the western settlements, the merchant's carriage." The woman took a slow drag of her cigar. The cherry glowed red. The smell of harsh, spiced tobacco filled the space, masking the predatory scent. She didn't look at Nadine's face. She looked at Nadine's chest. "Your heart is beating at 140 paces a minute," the woman observed. "You reek of fear. You smell of cheap ink, wet sheep, and starvation." Nadine swallowed hard. The realization settled in her gut like a stone. Werewolves. She had climbed into a pack carriage, and not just any pack, The wealth in this cabin, the velvet, the silver, the undisturbed calm of the woman across from her, spoke of high blood. "Stop the carriage," Nadine said. It was meant to be a demand, but it cracked in the middle. "We are already past the city gates," the woman replied smoothly. She leaned forward, the shadows peeling away from her face. There was a scar cutting through her left eyebrow, stark and white against her pale skin. "Do you know who I am, little rat?" "No," Nadine lied. The woman's smile was terrifying. It showed too many teeth. "Your pulse just jumped. You are lying. You know exactly what kind of beast you've locked yourself in a box with." Nadine squeezed her eyes shut. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a fighter. She was a 24-year-old clerk who spent her days trying to balance ledgers to afford firewood. She didn't want to die in a moving box smelling of cedar. "Please," Nadine said, opening her eyes. She let the exhaustion bleed into her voice, dropping the facade of bravery. "I'm nobody. Just a clerk. Open the door and I'll jump out. You won't even have to slow down." The woman observed her. The ice-pale eyes dragged over Nadine's shivering frame. The cheap-soaked wool, the ink stains on her fingers, the terrified, exhausted slump of her shoulders. "My name is Beatrix," the woman said softly, "and I am not going to throw you out of this carriage." Nadine blinked, confused. "You're going to kill me in here?" Beatrix let out a short, bark-like laugh. "If I wanted you dead, you would be a smear on the cobblestones of Oakhaven. No, I am going to take you home." "I don't have a home," Nadine said bitterly, before she could stop herself. "Good," Beatrix said, flicking a pile of ash onto the polished floorboards. "That makes this much easier." The journey was a waking nightmare. The carriage did not stop. It tore through the night, the massive draft horses pulling it with a tireless, unnatural endurance. Nadine huddled in her corner, shivering as her wet clothes began to dry stiff against her skin. The brazier offered heat, but it couldn't touch the ice in her veins. Beatrix did not speak for a long time. She watched the rain lash against the small, reinforced glass window. Every so often, she would turn her head, and Nadine would hear the slow, rhythmic intake of air through Beatrix's nose. She was scenting her, mapping her fear, her exhaustion, her utter lack of threat. "You aren't trembling as much," Beatrix noted eventually, breaking hours of silence. Nadine rubbed her arms. The rough wool scratched against her skin. "I've run out of energy to panic. If you were going to eat me, you'd have done it by now. The meat is getting tough." A smirk tugged at the corner of Beatrix's mouth. "Pragmatic. I appreciate that. Most humans scream, or they try to pray." "Prayer doesn't balance the ledger," Nadine muttered, clutching her leather satchel tighter. "An accountant." Beatrix shifted, crossing one long leg over the other. The heavy silver rings clinked. "You deal in numbers, debts, balances. You understand that everything has a cost." "I understand that I am severely out of my depth, and I don't know what you want with me." Nadine looked down at her muddy boots, ruining the pristine velvet. "I have no money. No family to ransom me. I have absolutely nothing of value." Beatrix leaned forward. The casual elegance vanished, replaced by a sudden heavy gravity. The air in the carriage seemed to thicken, pressing against Nadine's eardrums. It was the physical weight of an alpha's presence. Nadine's breath hitched, her lungs fighting for air. "My brother," Beatrix said, her voice dropping an octave, "is Garrett, the alpha of the northern reaches, the king of the frost-bitten." Nadine's stomach bottomed out. The king. She had stolen a ride from the royal pack. "He took the territory 3 years ago," Beatrix continued, her pale eyes locking onto Nadine's brown ones. "He fought his way to the top in blood and bone. But the crown is heavy, and the wolf inside him is close to the surface." Too close. Nadine didn't want to hear this. Knowing a pack's internal politics was a death sentence for a human. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because an alpha without an anchor becomes a monster," Beatrix said bluntly. "He is feral. He doesn't sleep. He barely speaks, he just hunts and kills. The pack is terrified of him. The elders are whispering about a challenge, and if they challenge him, he will slaughter them all, and our pack will tear itself apart. I don't care, Nadine said. It was a stupid, reckless thing to say. But she was so tired. I don't care about your brother, or your pack. What does this have to do with me? He needs a mate, Beatrix said. The words hung in the warm, cedar-scented air. Nadine stared at her. The silence stretched, until the rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves sounded like a metronome, ticking down to her execution. A mate, Nadine repeated, the word tasting foreign. You're taking me to your brother, because he needs a mate. Yes. Nadine let out a harsh, incredulous breath. The absurdity of it bubbled up in her chest, manifesting as a dry, choking laugh. You're insane. I'm a human. I'm a nobody. Wolves take other wolves. They take purebloods. They take daughters of alphas to form alliances. They don't take accountants they found shivering in a stolen carriage. Purebloods bore him, Beatrix snapped, her patience fraying. We have paraded every high-born she-wolf in the northern territories in front of him. They smell of entitlement, perfume, and political ambition. They look at him, and they see a crown. The wolf in him smells their greed, and he wants to rip their throats out. Beatrix reached across the small space. Her hand, surprisingly warm and impossibly strong, gripped Nadine's chin, forcing her head up. Nadine flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs. You? Beatrix murmured, inhaling deeply near Nadine's cheek. You smell like wet earth, old paper, and survival. There is no ambition in you, only endurance. You don't want a crown. You just want to live. Let go of me, Nadine whispered, trying to pull away. The grip tightened slightly, just enough to remind her that Beatrix could snap her neck with a flick of her wrist. He needs something real, Beatrix said, her eyes intense. Something grounded, an anchor to pull the man back from the beast. You are going to be that anchor. And if I refuse? Beatrix released her chin, sitting back in her seat. She smoothed her fur cloak. You have nowhere to go, little rat. No money, no family. Out there in the snow, you die of exposure or starvation. In the keep, you will be warm, you will be fed. And if you survive, my brother, you will be a queen. If I survive, Nadine repeated bitterly. He is not a gentle man, Beatrix warned, looking out the window as the landscape shifted from flat plains to jagged, snow-covered mountains, but he is loyal. If he accepts you, no one in this world will ever be allowed to touch you again. Nadine leaned her head against the cold glass. Her reflection stared back at her pale, dark circles under her eyes, her brown hair plastered to her skull. She didn't look like a queen. She looked like a sacrifice. How much further? Nadine asked, her voice hollow. We are here, Beatrix said. The carriage rolled to a halt, the wheels sinking into heavy, frozen mud. Nadine didn't move. Her limbs felt like lead. The brazier had burned down to embers, and the chill of the mountains was seeping through the floorboards. Beatrix kicked the door open. The iron hinges shrieked. Instantly, the smell hit them, not the romanticized scent of pine and fresh snow, but the brutal, industrial stench of a war camp. Wood smoke, raw butchered meat, wet dog, and the sharp, metallic tang of iron. Out! Beatrix commanded. Nadine grabbed her satchel, a pathetic shield, and stepped out of the carriage. Her boots hit the slush, sinking 2 inches. She stumbled, catching herself against the muddy wheel. The cold was a physical blow, punching the air from her lungs. The rain had turned to sleet here, driving hard against her skin. She looked up. The frost-bitten keep was not a castle. It was a fortress of dark, jagged stone, built directly into the side of a mountain. It looked less like it had been constructed and more like it had been violently carved out of the rock. Thick iron grates covered the lower windows. There were no banners, no decorative stonework, just sheer, defensive brutality. Around the courtyard, figures moved in the gloom. Men and women hauling massive logs, skinning deer, sharpening weapons at grinding stones. They were huge, wearing heavy furs and leathers, their hair unkempt, their eyes catching the torchlight with that same eerie, reflective glow. As Beatrix stepped down, the courtyard fell silent. The grinding of stones stopped. The dull thud of axes ceased. Dozens of pairs of glowing eyes turned toward the carriage. The air grew thick with tension. A low, collective rumble, a growl felt in the chest rather than heard, vibrated through the slush beneath Nadine's boots. They weren't looking at Beatrix. They were looking at Nadine. She was human. She was weak. And she was standing in the center of a predator's den. "Keep your eyes down, but do not cower," Beatrix muttered, grabbing Nadine by the elbow and marching her toward the massive wooden doors of the keep. "If you act like prey, they will treat you like it." Nadine forced her chin up, though her knees shook so violently she could barely walk. The smell of the pack was overwhelming. Sweat, blood, wet fur. As they passed a group of men skinning an elk, one of them took a step forward, his nostrils flaring as he caught Nadine's scent. Beatrix didn't break stride. She merely turned her head and let out a short, guttural snarl that sounded entirely unnatural, coming from a human throat. The man immediately dropped his gaze, exposing his neck, and stepped back. Nadine's breath came in short, ragged gasps. They entered the great hall. It was vast, cavernous, and suffocatingly hot. Massive hearths roared with whole tree trunks. The floor was uneven stone, scattered with rushes that smelled of spilled ale and dried mud. Long wooden tables were scarred with knife marks. But it was the silence that was terrifying. The hall was packed with wolves, but no one was speaking. They were all standing, rigid, their attention fixed on the far end of the room. Beatrix stopped, her grip on Nadine's arm tightening to the point of bruising. At the end of the hall, on a raised dais, there was no throne, just a heavy wooden chair, currently smashed into splinters. A man stood amidst the wreckage. Garrett. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a nightmare. He was massive, his chest bare and covered in scars, some old and faded, others raised and angry red. He was bleeding from a fresh gash across his ribcage, the blood dripping steadily onto the stone floor. His dark hair was matted with sweat. At his feet lay another man, unconscious and bleeding heavily from his face. Garrett was breathing heavily, his chest heaving. His hands were coated in blood. When he lifted his head, Nadine felt her heart stop. His eyes weren't just pale, they were completely feral. The irises were a burning, toxic yellow, bleeding into the whites. There was no humanity in that stare. Just pure, unadulterated violence. The beast was right at the surface, scratching at the back of his eyes, looking for something else to kill. "Garrett," Beatrix said. Her voice cut through the heavy silence of the hall. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Garrett's head snapped toward them. The movement was too fast, predatory and jerky. He didn't blink. A low rumble started deep in his chest, vibrating through the massive stone room. He stepped off the dais, moving with a loose-limbed, rolling grace that terrified Nadine more than the violence. He was a predator in its prime. The pack parted for him like water, pressing themselves against the tables, exposing their throats. He didn't look at his sister. He locked eyes with Nadine. Nadine's survival instincts screamed at her to run, to drop to the floor, to make herself as small as possible. The pressure radiating from him was physical, pressing down on her shoulders, forcing the air from her lungs. It demanded submission. She stood frozen, not out of bravery, but out of sheer, absolute paralysis. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her satchel. Garrett stopped 2 feet from her. He towered over her, radiating heat and the overwhelming scent of iron, adrenaline, and blood. Up close, he smelled dangerous, but beneath the blood, there was something else, wood smoke and cold earth. He leaned down, Nadine squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the bite, waiting for teeth to tear into her throat. Instead, she felt his breath against her neck. It was scorching hot. He inhaled, a deep, shuddering draw of air that scraped the bottom of his lungs. Nadine's knees finally buckled. She didn't fall to the floor. Garrett's hand shot out, grabbing her by the waist. His grip was entirely too hard, his fingers digging into the thick wool of her coat, hauling her flush against his chest. Her hand slapped against his bare, bloody skin to steady herself. He was burning up, a furnace of muscle and rage. He buried his face in her wet, stringy hair, breathing her in again. "What is this?" Garrett's voice was a ruin. It sounded like stones grinding together, harsh and unused to words. "An anchor," Beatrix said softly from a few feet away. Garrett didn't look at his sister. He slowly pulled back, just enough to look down into Nadine's face. His yellow eyes traced the dark circles under her eyes, the dirt on her cheek, the sheer, unmasked terror in her expression. He let out a scoff, a harsh, wet sound. "She is shaking like a leaf. She smells of fear." "She survived the carriage ride with me," Beatrix countered smoothly. "She is tougher than she looks. And more importantly, she smells of nothing but dirt and ledgers. She doesn't want your throne, Garrett." Garrett's thumb, slick with someone else's blood, smeared across Nadine's jawline. She flinched, biting the inside of her cheek to keep from crying out. "Ledgers," he murmured, the feral light in his eyes flickering, just for a second, replaced by a deep, profound exhaustion. He looked incredibly tired. The dark circles under his own eyes spoke of weeks without sleep. He didn't let her go. He looked back up at the silent hall, at the faces of his pack watching him, waiting for him to break, waiting for the madness to finally take him completely. Then he looked back at Nadine. "Mine," he rumbled, the word leaving no room for argument. He didn't sound in love. He sounded territorial, desperate, like a drowning man grabbing a piece of driftwood. Before Nadine could process the word, Garrett scooped her up into his arms, tossing her over his shoulder like a sack of grain. "Hey!" Nadine gasped. The wind knocked out of her as her stomach hit his solid shoulder. Her satchel dropped to the floor, the precious ledgers scattering across the dirty rushes. "Put me down!" Garrett ignored her. He turned his back on his sister, on his pack, on the bleeding man on the floor, and began marching toward the heavy stone stairs at the back of the hall. "Welcome to the Frostbitten, Nadine," Beatrix called out from behind them, the sound of a flint striking steel echoing as she lit another cigar. The stone stairs spiraled upward, tight and freezing. Nadine's stomach took the brunt of the abuse with every heavy, stomping step Garrett took. Her ribs ached. The scent of his blood, coppery and sharp, made her nauseous. She tried to push herself up, her hands bracing against the corded, sweat-slick muscles of his back. But his arm was a vice around her calves. "Stop fighting," he ground out. The words vibrated through his chest and directly into her bones. "Put me down and I'll walk," she gasped, her face bouncing against his shoulder blade. He didn't answer. He reached a landing and kicked a heavy oak door. It didn't budge. He kicked it again, the wood splintering around the iron frame, and it gave way with a violent crash. He carried her into the darkness, kicking the door shut behind them and throwing a deadbolt the size of Nadine's forearm. The locking mechanism sounded like a prison cell slamming shut. Garrett finally let her go. She hit the floor hard, her boots slipping on the bare stone, and scrambled backward until her spine hit the freezing wall. The room was pitch black, save for the moonlight slicing through a single, narrow window. There was no fire in the massive hearth. The air was frigid enough to see her own breath in rapid, terrified puffs. Garrett didn't look at her. He stumbled toward the center of the room. The predatory grace from the great hall was gone, replaced by a staggering, drunken clumsiness. He fell to his knees, his hands slamming into the stone floor. A horrific sound tore from his throat, a wet, tearing sound, halfway between a sob and a snarl. Nadine pressed her hands over her mouth. Her eyes adjusted to the silver light. The room wasn't a royal chamber. It was a containment unit. The walls were scarred with deep parallel gouges where stone had been chipped away by claws. The furniture was either bolted down or reduced to kindling in the corners. In the center of the room was a massive bed, built low to the ground and piled high with thick, heavy furs. "Garrett," she whispered. She didn't know why she said his name. It just slipped out, a desperate plea to humanize the monster shivering on the floor. His head snapped up. In the moonlight, his eyes were still that toxic, bleeding yellow. His jaw was clenched so tight she could hear his teeth grinding. He raised a hand, pressing the heel of his palm against his temple, and let out another ragged groan. He was fighting it. The beast. Beatrix's words echoed in Nadine's mind. He doesn't sleep. He barely speaks. He just hunts and kills. He crawled toward her. Nadine's breath hitched. She looked left, then right. There was no weapon, no escape. The door was bolted, and she wouldn't even be able to lift the iron bar, let alone open it before he caught her. "Please," she choked out, pressing herself harder against the wall. The rough stone bit through her damp wool coat. "I'm just a clerk. I don't know how to fix this." He didn't lunge. He dragged himself the last few feet, his movements jerky and agonizing. He stopped, right in front of her boots. The heat rolling off his skin was suffocating, battling the freezing air of the room. He smelled like adrenaline, pine, and wet copper. He reached out. His hand was massive, his knuckles busted and split, his nails lengthening into thick, dark claws. He hovered his hand over her knee, trembling violently. Nadine closed her eyes. She braced for the pain. Instead, a heavy, dead weight collapsed into her lap. Nadine's eyes flew open. Garrett had dropped face first onto her knees, his arms banded around her waist, locking her in place, his face buried in the thick, wet wool of her coat directly over her stomach. She froze. Her hands hovered awkwardly in the air. Garrett took a deep, shuddering breath. His nose pressed hard against her ribs. He exhaled slowly, the hot air soaking through her clothes. Then he did it again. Inhale, exhale. He was listening to her heartbeat. Nadine's pulse was hammering a frantic rhythm, 140 beats a minute, just like Beatrix had said. But as the seconds ticked by, and Garrett didn't bite, didn't tear, didn't move, the frantic drumming began to slow. She was exhausted. She was freezing, and she was trapped under 250 pounds of feral alpha. But she wasn't dead. As her heartbeat steadied into a slower, more rhythmic thump, Garrett's breathing mirrored it. The violent tremors racking his massive frame began to subside. The claws digging into the stone floor slowly retracted. "Cold," he mumbled against her stomach. His voice was completely different now. The gravel and the roar were gone. He just sounded so incredibly tired. Nadine swallowed the lump in her throat. She looked down at the mop of dark, sweat-soaked hair resting on her lap. She wasn't a queen. She wasn't a mate. She was a weighted blanket for a man losing his mind. Slowly, hesitantly, she lowered her numb hands. She didn't touch his hair. She just let her hands rest on his broad, scarred shoulders. His skin was burning hot, but the cold of the room was seeping into her bones. "I'm freezing," she whispered to the dark room. Garrett shifted. He didn't let her go. Instead, he pulled himself up, hauling her with him. Nadine gasped as her feet left the floor. He carried her to the massive bed, dropping her into the center of the furs. Before she could scramble away, he was beside her. He dragged the heavy pelts over them both, trapping her in a cocoon of body heat, wolf musk, and old blood. He threw one heavy arm over her chest, pinning her flat against the mattress, and pressed his face into the crook of her neck. Nadine lay rigid, staring up at the dark stone ceiling. He took one more deep breath, inhaling the scent of her damp skin and cheap soap. Within 30 seconds, the alpha of the northern reaches was dead asleep. Nadine woke to the sensation of her left arm being entirely amputated. She blinked, her eyes gritty and dry. Pale, gray morning light filtered through the single window, illuminating the dust motes, dancing in the freezing air. She tried to move her arm, but it was pinned beneath a solid wall of muscle. Garrett was still asleep. In the daylight, the horror of the night before peeled away to reveal a starker, sadder reality. He wasn't a towering monster right now. He was just a man with too many scars. The yellow, toxic burn of his eyes was hidden beneath dark lashes. The deep bags under his eyes were bruised purple. The gash across his ribs had clotted, leaving a thick crust of dried blood against his pale skin. He was breathing deeply, evenly. The crushing anxiety that had radiated from him the night before was gone, replaced by a heavy, deadened exhaustion. Nadine carefully, agonizingly, began to slide her left arm out from under his chest. Centimeter by centimeter, she pulled. The friction of her wool coat against his bare skin felt impossibly loud in the quiet room. She held her breath. Just a little more. Garrett's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. Nadine froze. His eyes opened. They weren't yellow anymore. They were a deep, clear amber. They were lucid, intelligent, and completely focused on her face. He didn't look feral. He looked dangerous. "Don't run," he said. His voice was a low rumble, thick with sleep but laced with absolute authority. "I'm not running," Nadine said, her voice croaking. Her throat was bone dry. "I'm trying to get my arm back." "You're cutting off the circulation." Garrett stared at her for a long moment. He looked down at his hand wrapped around her wrist, then up at her face. He blinked, as if struggling to piece together how exactly she had ended up in his bed. He released her wrist and rolled onto his back, dragging a hand down his face. "You're the human." "Nadine," she corrected, rubbing her tingling arm. She sat up, pulling the furs tightly around her shoulders. The room was still freezing. "And yes, I'm the human your sister kidnapped." Garrett winced, rubbing his temples. "Beatrix has no concept of diplomacy. She said you needed an anchor. She didn't mention I'd be used as a mattress." Nadine looked around the wrecked room. Now that the immediate threat of death had passed, the pragmatism that kept her alive as a half-starved clerk was kicking in. Panic burned too many calories. Anger, however, was useful. Garrett turned his head on the pillow to look at her. The amber eyes narrowed slightly. "You aren't trembling." "I'm too thirsty to tremble," Nadine said bluntly. "And I want my bag back." "Your bag?" He sounded genuinely confused. "You are sitting in the bed of an alpha, locked in a keep deep in werewolf territory. And you want your bag? It has my ledgers in it," she snapped, pushing her messy brown hair out of her face. "It took me 3 months to balance the grain shipments for Oakhaven. If I don't have them, I don't get paid. And considering I am currently sitting in a freezing room with a man who was bleeding all over me 12 hours ago, I'd like some semblance of my actual life back." Garrett stared at her. A heavy silence stretched between them. The muscles in his jaw ticked. Nadine suddenly realized she had just yelled at a man who could crush her skull with one hand. She swallowed hard, her bravado faltering, and pulled the fur tighter. Slowly, the corner of Garrett's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, exactly, but the tension in his face cracked. He let out a low, rough exhale that might have been a laugh if he knew how to do it anymore. "Ledgers." "Yes," she said, lifting her chin. "Ledgers." Garrett sat up. The furs fell away from his chest, exposing the ruined landscape of his torso. He didn't seem to notice the cold. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, planting his bare feet on the freezing stone. "I haven't slept a full night in 4 months, Garrett said, his back to her. He was staring at the splintered wood of the door. "Every time I closed my eyes, the wolf would tear through my mind, hunting. It wanted blood. It wanted to tear the throat out of anyone who challenged me." He turned his head slightly, looking at her over his shoulder. "Last night, there was no hunt," he said quietly. "There was just the sound of your heart. It was slow. It was steady. It made the wolf shut up." Nadine hugged her knees to her chest. So what does that make me? A sedative? Garrett stood. He was massive, his head nearly brushing the iron chandelier hanging from the low ceiling. He walked over to a heavy oak wash basin, cracking the thin layer of ice over the water with his knuckles. He splashed the freezing water over his face and chest, washing away the dried blood. "It makes you mine," he said, reaching for a towel. He turned back to her, leaning against the wooden basin. The feral madness was gone, but the possessive edge to his voice remained. It was a statement of fact, a claim. Beatrix was right. You don't reek of ambition. You don't want my territory. You just want your ledgers. "I want to go home," Nadine said, though the words felt hollow. She didn't have a home. She had a drafty room above a tavern that she couldn't afford. "You are home," Garrett countered smoothly. He walked back to the bed, leaning over her. Nadine pressed back into the headboard. He didn't touch her, but he trapped her between his arms, his face inches from hers. He smelled like cold water and clean skin now. "You keep the madness away. You keep my pack safe from me. In return, I will give you anything you want. Gold, heat, food. And if I say no?" she whispered. "I won't let you leave," he said honestly, his amber eyes locked on hers. "But I won't hurt you. I will never hurt you, Nadine. That is the cost of this transaction." Nadine looked into his eyes. There was no deception there, just the raw, brutal honesty of a predator, negotiating for its own survival. He needed her to survive his own mind. She needed him to survive the winter. It was an exchange, a trade of services. Nadine was an accountant. She understood transactions. She understood the weight of a debt and the necessity of a balanced ledger. She took a slow breath, matching his gaze without looking away. "I want a bath," she said, her voice steady. "I want my ledgers brought up from the great hall, unruined. I want a fire in that hearth. And I want to know exactly what the terms of this anchoring are, because I am not spending the rest of my life trapped in a freezing room, being used as a heartbeat monitor." Garrett stared at her for a long, heavy moment. Then, the alpha of the northern reaches threw his head back and laughed. It was a rusty, unused sound, echoing loudly off the stone walls, startling the tension out of the freezing air. "A bath," he repeated, looking back down at her with a gleam of genuine amusement in his amber eyes. "And a fire." "Yes," Nadine said firmly. Garrett pushed off the bed, walking toward the splintered door. He grabbed the heavy iron deadbolt and hauled it back. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Beatrix!" He roared down the stairwell, his voice vibrating with command. The lethargy of the past months completely gone. "Get the human a bath, and find her damn bag." He turned back to Nadine, leaning in the doorway. The shadows of the hallway framed his massive silhouette. "We have a deal, Nadine," he said, a slow, dangerous smile finally breaking across his scarred face. "Let's balance the ledger." Did Nadine's courage earn her survival, or did she just lock herself in a cage with a beast? If you loved this deep dive into the brutal, beautiful world of the Frostbitten Keep, hit that like button, share this story with your fellow dark romance readers, and subscribe. Drop a comment below. What would you ask for if an Alpha King owed you his sanity?